Afternoon and welcome to Corny and Barrow Bordeaux Unpicked. We are back, not with a brand new invention, however, something has grabbed hold of us, and that's Bordeaux 2025. I'm joined this afternoon with the first of our En Primeur 2025 campaign podcasts with William. Hello.
Joseph, yeah. Good
Very
afternoon.
nice.
Very nice to be asked about the pod while we were in Bordeaux by a few people.
It was actually, yeah.
Very good. And I noticed you got quite gloaty then. Anyway, good.
Chap at Cos was saying he listened and started crying, but anyway. Guy, hello.
Hello, Joe. Good to see you.
Thank you. And we've got Mark in the house, Mark Ditcham.
Good to see you also.
So, look, we are a little bit delayed with this podcast in terms of what we wanted to. Just lots been going on internally, which is all good because busy work is productive work. And we would like to sort of start off the series, as in usual fashion, with a bit of a summary on our trip. We spent 5 days, the four of us here, hence why we have decided to come and grace your earage. And thought we'd maybe start with a bit of a roundup on the 25 vintage report with you, Guy, yeah?
Thank you, Joe. Well, as you rightly pointed out just now, as we were discussing this, everyone has obviously read the vintage report, which is online already. So I won't go through the blow-by-blow account of it. But in terms of the lowdown and the sort of character of the wines, the Bordeaux season in 25 was defined by low yields. So this is a vintage of small quantities, intense concentration. So that is both tannin and fruit. And that resulted from a warm, dry growing season. And the character of the wines that has resulted has really been forged by what was more than anything a dry growing season. And it's something where the flowering was slightly affected, so that a small number of flowers on the vine translated into a small number of berries. Those berries then, throughout the dry, warm growing season, developed into grapes with relatively little juice. So there was quite a high ratio of skins to juice. And that has meant that you had the potential at, let's say, the sort of early August point of the season for a very dense, concentrated, rich vintage. That then had a little bit of an about turn. There was quite a lot of rain. There was about 60 millimeters of rain in late August and early September. And that really freshened up the profile of the wines, and it's reduced the alcohols. So of the wines that we tasted in Bordeaux, 13% ABV was the average, pretty low by Bordeaux standards these days. And the pHs were pretty low. So in acidity terms, we're looking at a fairly fresh vintage. So really that late bout of rain has changed a little bit the character of the vintage, and I think we were agreed that it's for the better. So I think there is this freshness. And one of the comparisons that we can maybe come on to discuss is that there are similarities with the 22 vintage and growing season in Bordeaux. The crucial difference was maybe this late addition of rain and freshness in 25, which has made for a quite different profile of wine. But in a nutshell, that's the growing season.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite strange to think, you hit the nail on the head, 22, the big change around was this rain that came in, and 60, I know some people reported up to 100 mils in two sort of bouts across, depending on where they were. But it's the massive game changer, isn't it? It allowed, refreshed vineyards, sort of built back some sort of vigor into the vines, and then there was a little bit more maturity, and phenolic maturity then developed in a completely different direction. Allowed obviously a little bit of swelling, I guess, within the grapes, but ultimately, as you said, still incredibly small. I mean, I remember Christian Moix at our lunch, he was talking about Merlot, and normally Merlot they're picking in a sort of a healthy harvest, and there's about 1.5 grams to 1.8 grams of berry. They were coming in at 0.8 grams, so it's just the amount of grapes needed to make the sort of usual volume of wine was far higher. But I think that's it, and I think it's a lovely vintage. It's more than lovely. It's a really, really very good vintage. And funny to think that's all thanks to that period of rain, really, because it's the freshness that you find in there, the lower alcohols, is remarkable. But I think one element you touched on that we should probably talk about and see what your thoughts are, and then we'll delve into our sort of 5 days and our experience in Bordeaux from tasting and conversations we had. Tannin. I mean, that's it. I think it's all about, this 25 is for me is about tannin, the structure of those those grains, the shape of them, how they've been played into the wines, how freshness balances it. I know when I sent out my sort of email about the vintage last week, I was brutally honest in that I craved the wines that gave us sort of a juicier fruit profile, and there's plenty of them, and there's a lovely ripeness there, with that concentration that you spoke about, but also in a sort of open, playful way for quite a few of them across the one we were tasting there. And then the way that interplayed with the textural appeal, where the tannins obviously part there, is so crucial into whether they're powdery, how long they are, the abundance or the impression of abundance plays all into that. But there are also wines that I found that were very taut, quite lackluster in fruit, and were kind of felt like they pulled back. And those are the ones that I'm probably going to be saying to avoid. But yeah, and that's where the tannin.
I don't think there were many. I don't think that. I sort of politely disagree with some of that. I don't think that there were many wines that I would say to avoid. I thought actually the lack of poor wines was one of the real characteristics of it. But also, and I know you're talking about the tannins, but I think that's maybe getting a little sort of over technical in a way. And that what I found was that I think if you look at it compared to 22, which is a legendary vintage that will probably outlast some of us, and I think is the real deal, I think that 25 has a lot more of 19 about it, in that I think these wines will show well in 5, 6, 7 years' time and will be more approachable. And I think, as I keep banging on about, 19 is a really crucial vintage for Bordeaux, because I think you can drink wines from the very top of the tree even now and really enjoy them, rather than say, oh, they're going to be brilliant in 4, 5, 6 years or 2 decades or whatever. So I think this is a sort of successor to 19 in a way, also insofar as it doesn't really favour either bank. There were great wines left and right bank. The rain came before anyone was choosing to pick either Merlot or, had it come a month later, then you would say Merlot was amazing and the Cabernets got rained on. If it had come 2 or 3 weeks later, you could have said the opposite. So, I think it's, we don't want to overgeneralize, but I think there's a lot of good wine in 25.
Yeah, I'm certainly with you. The amount of those wines, which I mentioned, are certainly in a minority, but they were just there. The consistency is very good. And, we were chatting beforehand, I was looking through my tasting notebook and the scores, and the average is probably 17 and a half, which is very strong. There are some great wines that are sort of nudging above 18.
The surprising thing for me is that on paper, high tannin vintage with a lot of concentration, you would think they're actually quite hard wines to taste. Yeah. But the experience of tasting for me was quite easy. I mean, they were a joy to taste, and that was a bit of a surprise. And I think to your point about it resembling 19 in a sense, I understand why you say that, because I think there is this ease to the wines and there's this kind of fluidity to them, which was a good surprise.
Are we all in agreement then that it is quite a unique vintage? Because people that I've spoken to, there are comparable vintages, but no one I think is allied as to what actually it is replicated to.
No, I think that's fair. I think that's right. I mean, were the wines that you had the most day-to-day contact with Bordeaux of any of us? Were the wines a little bit as you were expecting them to be from what Negotiation and things like that had said, or?
The perception, obviously, reading about the vintage in advance of going out there was a very, very strong perception about it being an incredible vintage. There was a lot of talk and a lot of hype about it, but I think actually, on retrospect and us going out there and again speaking to the trade as we all do, I think we've now calmed down a little. It's still a very, very good vintage, but I think the reflection is somewhat different and our overall assessment has changed.
I don't think it's an incredible vintage. I think it's a very good vintage. And the element that I probably like the most about it is terroir comes through. The personalities of individual Margaux, so appellation sort of influences from the different soil types, from Saint-Emilion, Margaux, Saint-Julien, etc., I think play a part and are not masked by the style of the wines, despite that concentration, despite that playful fruit and the structure and the tannins. Where 22, when we taste the EP, you sort of had to really go looking for that sort of gravel component or that clay or that limestone side of it.
Which is very, very, very different vintage, and I said this a few times when we were out there, from what it would have been 15 years ago.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
okay, that's not massively relevant maybe, but they could have made monsters out of these. The way Bordeaux works now in terms of wanting the wines to be approachable, to be more balanced sort of off the bat, I think makes the most of translating a vintage like this, which I would firmly put as a 4.5 nudging 5-star vintage. I'd put it behind 16 and 22 maybe, but otherwise I'd put it right up there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, again, to speak about comparisons or differences from 22, I think in 22 you had this kind of veneer of fruit to begin with, and that will drop away, of course, and that's what makes the 22s long-term wines. There is an innate power and sort of majesty to the 22s. I don't think we're in the same realm in 25, but I think what you do have is this sense of transparency and clarity of definition, of terroir, of a sense of place, all of these things that we want in high quality wines. Maybe they won't live for as long as the 22s, but in today's world with today's preferences and tastes in terms of drinking, does that matter actually? I mean, is
no, I think, going on to Will's point, there is fundamentally there's a drinkability about these wines that's already been expressed, and I don't think that's going to go away. Okay, look, there's the odd wine here and there which was definitely built for the cellar, but you can only make and reflect what you've been given.
One other point I would make about this, as a vintage generally, before we're moving on to sort of going around the regions or whatever, but is how different Bordeaux is in terms of their treatment of the amount of second wines and things they make now. I think more and more people spoke to us about the second wines aren't really second wines of assemblage there because we have a site here or a site there. Obviously, you can go the full range, and someone like Francois Micheville, who we'll come on to, who doesn't make second wines at all because it's a Vin de Cru, it reflects the site. I think more and more people in Bordeaux are trying to do that, and they just have some outlying plots that they might put into a second wine. But I do like the way that Bordeaux is trying to make more. They're trying to make more and more first wine in most cases, and I think this is a good thing because I think what the market needs is, in a way, is a proper, realistic volume of wine from these estates that comes onto the market at a price that people want to buy it at, with a view to drinking it.
You also have to remember that this is the smallest vintage since 91, so by virtue, there'll be less second wines or need for second wines because most
And I
will
think
go into
post Parker, and to a degree, Michel Ryan rather died just before the harvest, and obviously, that it's very sad, but he was a part of the Parker scenario in a way, in terms of the way some of the wines are. And I think it's, Bordeaux from 19 onwards has kind of changed itself quite a bit.
Okay.
It was the earliest harvest since the 19th century. Just to go alongside the fact that it was this is for Latour. I'm just looking at my notes, and they said they started on the 30th of August, and it was the earliest in a long time. To go with your fact that it was very small. I mean, some estates lost more than half the crop.
Yeah, 15 or 12 hectoliters was the smallest I think we came to.
Yeah.
Well, before we move on, but how would you agree or disagree? Because I don't necessarily like the term, but for me, I've come to think about 25 as a modern day classic. And what I mean about that is there's the influence of current weather patterns that we are facing and that we've faced over the last 5 years. So the influence of them, but then you've got, going back to the sort of the typicity side and the terroir coming through, you've got these old school, brilliant intricacies and elements that show within the wine. With Pauillac, I've really liked generally as a range of wines. You've got that tobacco and that.
But Guy made the point earlier, and I would totally agree with this. I can remember tasting Bordeaux in 2010, 2015, these kind of vintages, and you were properly exhausted. Your lips were swollen and red, and all the rest of your teeth were whatever. There is that, and I think you can't get away from the fact that the lesser alcohol has an effect on that because it reduces the sweetness and it reduces the sort of hedonistic element a little bit. But a modern day classic is, again, there's always a worry that using the dreaded classic word is sort of derogatory, but no, I think these are going to have real drinkability for a long time. Like 5-6 years for most of them, and then you'll be able to pop them and drink them for 10, 15 and more. So
there's
I hate to disagree with you, Joseph, but I kind of have to.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, we'll get that recorded. I'll put that as my ringtone for when you call.
Yeah.
So let's move on then to appellations. If they want to sort of put a little spotlight from it. Oh, why don't we start with the right bank?
Which is where we started.
Exactly. Yeah, we did a small little visit on the left on arrival, and then spent a lot of the time on the right. Ditch, what was your sort of impressions of Saint-Emilion, Pomerol, the sort of satellites that we tried?
So I joined you a little bit later. So I started at Clos Saint-Martin, which was a revelation for me. It's a wine I bought many, many years ago. I bought some half bottles of it, I think 01
Cool
Cobalt.
place, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really cool. And
Yeah.
Sophie Ficard was an impressive character, owner, general manager. I think she probably is out in the vines as well. She probably does a little bit of everything.
Well,
So-
you've got 1 hectare. You got
yeah,
to
it's,
do.
it's the smallest. It's the smallest Grand Cru Classé in Santa Milan. So that was a very, very good start. I enjoyed the wines a lot. And then we did the tasting at Moex,
Yep.
at Belay Menange. So for me, the introduction was very high indeed. It was a high bar to start, but yeah, I enjoyed the wines on the right bank incredibly. As you said earlier, they certainly reflected a lot of the typicity of the limestone and the clay, as you would expect.
Yeah.
And yeah, they weren't overly bombastic or heavy or hedonistic or rich, but they certainly had that lovely
weren't
luscious
shy,
fruit.
yeah.
Yeah, they weren't shy or sort of
Yeah.
reticent either. So yeah, I really enjoyed the right bank in the first day that I was there. So
Yeah, it's just on relating into this, because quite often people like to ask, is it a right bank vintage, is it a left bank vintage, is it a Merlot vintage, is it a Cabernet vintage? And I don't think there's an obvious answer. I do think that Merlot has played a very serious role, though, on both sides. For the right bank, for obvious reasons, but on the left bank, generally speaking, Merlot blends were up, and I think it's interesting because we're talking to some producers on the right bank, and they. Edward Moex had a conversation about this and about how they can sort of deal with, particularly on certain, forget the sort of limestone and clay, but even in gravel, how they can deal with sort of heat and how it responds in terms of its overall phenolic balance and maturity as the grapes go through the growing season with that sort of prolonged stress, and can add what seems to be a little benefit to freshness and what seems to be a benefit to overall textural styles as well.
It's extraordinary because 10, 12 years ago, the death knell was out for Merlot.
I know.
Everyone was wanting to sort of put the boot in and, the wine's going to be...
sideways- the
Well, it was
sideways effect,
sideways
yeah.
plus. Yeah, exactly. And everyone was sort of like, oh, they're not... And I think it just shows, and we've seen it in all sorts of wine regions around the world, from Piedmont to Burgundy to Champagne to wherever, that the vine is a serial survivalist and a really crafty sort of plant. It sucks these things up, and I think yes, 03 was very, very hot, and then it's had vintages since then that have been hot. 18 was very, very hot. 22 was very, very hot, and maybe as a kick on from 18 and 22 now, I would agree. And I think the really good thing, and you touched on it, Joe and Guy, you have in your notes, is that the vineyards, let alone the communes, really showed a difference. You could tell, and it's not always the case at all, whether something was a Santaminian or a Pomerol. You go back 15, 20 years, it's quite hard to tell the difference at times because winemaking took over.
Early stage.
And so I think, the vines are adapting, and the whole Merlot is, grubbing up your Merlot to put in Syrah, as people were starting to suggest 10, 15 years ago, is a load of nonsense.
Yeah.
On Santamilion, just before we move on, the two wines that I would mention is Cheval Blanc, so obviously very high profile estates, and they were cropping at 15 hectolitres per hectare. So that's the same as Chateau Trossinois, for example, in Pomerol. So very small crop. Pierre-Olivier Clouet, brilliant winemaker to taste with, because he's very open and very sort of up for a discussion on the character of the vintage always. He gave us a few interesting stats, and it was him who sort of described the rain at the end of the growing season as a total game changer. And he said that, some of my winemaker colleagues will say that this wasn't dilution, but physiologically this was dilution. Yeah. And, he sort of spun
Good
into-
dilution.
Good dilution, yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that's a very honest take on what happened at the end of the season. He described it as 2010 with low alcohol, just on the point of, other comparable vintages. It was very much a sort of more academic and inverted commas Cheval Blanc this year, I think. It wasn't a big sort of extrovert. It was a wine that made you think, didn't really have the voluptuousness or sweetness or plumpness that proper, as you would say, Mr. Hargrave, yeah. And, low alcohol, 12.7% ABV. He also made the point that there was this real dryness and, they had huge concentration in the berries, but you needed, as you were saying, Joe, earlier on, you needed around a third more number of berries in order to make the same amount of juice.
Yeah.
So, a very strong, but sort of perhaps slightly atypical Cheval Blanc. And then the other one in Saint-Emilion to mention would be Peter Sissek's Rocheron, which again, was defined in a sense by the relatively small crop. I mean, Peter said that he came in at 30 hectolitres per hectare, which actually isn't too small in the grand scheme of things. But he says he made the interesting point that below, or rather above that sort of level of yield, you don't get the same limestone character. So I think that's an interesting point to kind of draw out, that the smallness of the crop has actually enables this sense of texture in the wines and this real sense of nuance and fine limestone definition in the ones that are on the plateau in Saint-Emilion. So
Yeah. I
And
think,
obviously Treachery Boeuf, but we'll come on to that later.
course, yeah.
That's another,
yeah, no, indeed. I mean,
It's always a little bit of a case apart.
yeah. I mean, Roche, you sort of started. I was going to talk about that. I love that taste with Peter. And as a side note on that one, he also opened the 24, which is insane how that has changed and gone up a gear into balance and harmony with no preconceptions on what you think 24 would be like. I just think that wine is unbelievable, and I was very, very impressed with it because it didn't feel like that sort of cold and rainy vintage that we saw. I think I'd also give a shout out Saint-Emilion wise. I thought Canon did a really very good job. Have I stolen that from you, Ditch? I know
Yes,
you were
Canon.
for-
That was
Canon fodder.
one of my wines of the vintage. Yeah.
You and Canon were hand in hand. Yeah.
And obviously Ben Melange, but again, we'll cover that off when we talk about the Merck's stable more. But
I also enjoyed Clos Forte this year. I think you did
Yeah.
for the first time, maybe.
For a few years. I mean, it's a lovely estate. And again, what's coming in for me, what the main consistency I found, alongside what Will said about, okay, there's obvious stark difference between Saint-Emilion and Pomerol, but that textural side I think was pretty much throughout all of the right bank wines we tried, and that is what will stay with me. But yeah, Pomerol, it ranged from quintessential Pomerol in terms of generosity, plumpness, fruit, everything there, to ones that actually had a little bit more stricter finish and things that sort of tapered in on the end. But that was mainly to do with, again, the sites and where they are. And that's, if you're a Pomerol fan, 25 is a vintage where you kind of want to, throw the dice and get quite a few.
they did what they should do, and the wines always were different. And okay, there was no La Grave Pomerol because it just didn't like that drier spell earlier on. But La Grange Pomerol was an absolute. Was just brilliant. Really hit the bullseye, I think, at its price range. It's crazy. You get Trotanoy. We were arguing about whether that was better than La Fleur Petrus or not. I mean, these are good arguments to have.
Yeah.
And I think Pomerol is, and yes, we're biased, but our bias is well founded. I think Pomerol is probably, along with Saint Julien, the highest overall quality commune because they're just a great number of great properties who know what they're doing.
Yeah, that's a relatively small space. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, if we hop across to the left, and Guy, where would you say in terms of which appellations, if there's one or two you'd give a specific mention to? Do you think there is one in there, or is there?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned briefly in passing Boyac, and for me, I love that Cassisi graphite-y sort of pencil shaving style that you can get from Great Boyac, and I thought that was there in spades this year. So I thought that was an absolute delight. And I mean, the real flagship, I guess, is Lafite, and the fact that they really had an abundance of that character, I thought was beautiful. One appellation I would mention, which is sometimes quite up and down because it's a large appellation, and there is a lot of variation in terms of site and blend and terroir, is Margaux, which I thought was remarkably consistent this year, and again, sort of going to the top ends of the range. Just as an illustration, Chateau Margaux I thought was beautiful. It was perfumed, it was racy, it sort of had everything that you would maybe want from Great Margaux, that sort of abundance of aroma under which is this real bedrock of kind of chalky texture and nuance. But it was interesting that Margaux was picked quite a lot later than a lot of its neighbours.
Acidity. because I
Yeah.
tasted it with you and I joined you. But yes, it was. They said it was like 3.7 something, wasn't it?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, but I think you want. I mean, I would totally agree. I think that Margot and funny enough, Santamino as well, although we've done that, can be the most sort of slightly erratic, sort of schizophrenic in terms of their what wines you get from there. The sort of name on the label in a way means the least. But you want your Margot to be quite lifted and fruited and forward in a way, aromatic. And I would totally agree. I thought, yeah, it's not normal that you can say that, but Margot was very, very good.
Yeah, I
And
think
Pauillac, I would agree with that. But
yeah, one of the sort of things that jumped out to me was you mentioned earlier. Normally, you go there, and Saint Julien is the one that stands above every other appellation in terms of consistency, of accessibility, and charm. And so you're automatically just drawn in. This was a year where I noticed that wasn't the case, and it just speaks volumes that I think, and by extension, I want to mention Santa Steph. You know, the furthest north appellation, northernmost appellation. Normally, you know, the warmest, the driest, and you go into a vintage like 25 thinking, crikey, how have they handled all that heat? Obviously, we weren't as clued up before going there, the full impacts that all of that rain, that cane at the end of August, beginning of September would have had. But I thought the wines that I tasted from Santa Steph were very, very strong. From value end at Catburn, I thought was just an absolute joy. And I think that's going to be a lovely wine to open for very, very good value. But I think Cos and Calon were strong. We didn't taste Montrose, unfortunately. But there was a real heart on the sleeve feel to the Santa Steph.
they were proper Santa Steph.
But refined as well on the palate because of that extra rainfall.
In theory, Santa Steph could have made some absolute monsters in a year like this, but somehow they've made real balanced wines.
Yeah. I mean, particularly, and not because he said he mentioned Apollo, I really liked Cos de Sonel from there. But I mean, you know, we don't want to carry on. We've gone on too long. We'll maybe outside of our agencies, because we will talk about them in more detail because they deserve that. If you were to sort of pick your top wine of the vintage or tasted, what would it be?
Straight in with a tough question.
I thought Lalonde was very, very good. If we're going away from the obvious candidates, I mean, okay, it's a super second, so it's a pretty obvious candidate. But I thought the first grades all did pretty well. But Lalonde would be right up there. Yeah. Trying to go the mill, I haven't said that. Baron was good. Lynch, you know, a lot of the people who should be good were good. One little sleeper, sort of non-agency one that I thought was very good and has been for a little while was Talbot.
Talbot was really good.
I think, and I know it's sort of sounds dreadful, and they won't think this is sort of seen as a bit of a sort of granddad's claret type scenario because it's very sort of English in a way. But they've been making great wine for the last 4, 5, 6 years, and I thought for the kind of price they should be, I think it's something people really enjoy drinking on a Wednesday, Thursday night in 10 years' time.
Yeah. I mean, the standout performer for me, and usual adopting the man of the people corner, I mean, Lafite was just absolutely staggeringly good. It's I think Saskia's obviously been galvanizing change there over the sort of 5, 6 years, because it had unbelievable seduction and succulence, but refinement and elegance and all of that Pauillac typicity that you want, and already in this insane harmony. I mean, everything was pretty full on and high, but the way that they managed to sort of round it all
It
up.
was the last tasting on day one, wasn't it? And we were actually half an hour early. Actually, it's ever happened in the history of CMV to still be early at the end of the day. But
after that in Pauillac, I agree with you. I thought Lalonde was brilliant. That was my second favourite Pauillac. Lynch, maybe third. Probably third, actually.
Well, yeah, I mean, we haven't talked at all about either Pessac or white wines. So I'm going to say
let's go
Haut-Brion Blanc, which I thought was a absolutely beautiful wine. And, you know, it's...
That's another man of the people.
Join me in the corner. Tagged in.
Well, look, you put me on the spot, so...
No, quite right.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, not an easy wine to either get an allocation of or afford, but yeah, beautiful, you know, at the top of the tree.
For me, it was Domaine de Chevalier.
Right.
Rouge. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, that's a good shout. That was very good.
On the hanger tasting, I think I mentioned it to you.
No, I totally agree.
You agreed. That's just been released as well.
There he is. That is Dish. Lurking in the background.
but I mean,
comes in with a sucker punch.
I think I've got a blog coming out fairly soon on white Bordeaux in a very sort of generic way. But I mean, you know, there are some cracking wines being made. White Bordeaux and whether it's Saint-Emilion ones or whatever, you know, they take the white wines pretty seriously. And actually, if you're looking at, you know, you're out there and you're looking at drinking and trying things, and in amongst the tastings, and they're pretty much finished wines. Okay, we're only 6 months from harvest when we taste them, but there's a lot of good stuff going on there.
Yeah.
There's not too much shrill over Sauvignon, but on the other hand, there's not too much wood. It's just a white Bordeaux, good balance.
Yeah. Larrivée Haut Briand Blanc, I'd like to give a little mention. I thought.
Oh yeah, you were banging on about that.
Yeah, I thought
Yeah.
it was superb. Minerality, texture of
the
freshness.
standards because you kept making me go back. Yeah.
Yeah. Well done to them. Well, before so let's finish on a slightly different note. We went and we put in 4 or 5 new restaurant choices thanks to me taking the lead on those bookings whilst we were there. So we went to a lovely place called Le Classique in Bordeaux.
That was very
Centre.
good. Yeah,
we
that was
liked
great.
that a lot.
Yeah.
Bit of theatre at the table. They came and flambéed my veal nicely in front of me.
Yeah, they were a good team. Really
Yeah,
nice team. I mean,
very
interesting
cool.
bit of parking going on. Have you had a ticket for that yet? Or
Oh, they somehow never find their way to me.
good.
Because it was in my name, the guy. So
Exactly. For it.
I'll let you know.
And also, we had a really cool lunch. We went to a place called Le Jardin at Château Soutard.
Yes.
Great private room if you're looking for a private room for a function there, especially lunchtime, because you've got to if the weather is favourable, you've got these brilliant views. But it's got a lovely garden out the front. Food, I thought, was pretty spot on. Great cheese trolley. I mean, that was if you
I don't remember the
Eccles
cheese.
would be on.
Oh yes,
we
okay,
were there, yeah. Which was great. We went to a little place that we like, Clos Marons, for lunch as well, and Montagne, and Café Cuisine. Your first trip there in Iran.
Actually, I went to Moron the week earlier on a personal visit.
Oh yeah, there you go.
So yes, that was lovely.
If you can't
Very
find
nice.
Ditch, if you can't find Ditch at 1TMS, you will find it.
And
on
also Il
In the
Papone.
Montaigne.
Il Papone,
Yes,
although Mr. Senna
in
wasn't
Bordeaux.
feeling so good by that point. But yeah, brilliant in Bordeaux for the Italian with the
Oh,
quint.
yeah.
And we managed a couple of Quintarellis from their cellar. So yeah, no, Bordeaux is
Quintarelli and pizza. That's what
Yeah.
you go. That's what you go to Bordeaux for.
can't go wrong.
Okay. Right. Brilliant. Well, hopefully, listeners, you managed to get something from that, and it wasn't too much just thrown at you in one go. But we loved going there. We like talking about it. But there'll be plenty more pods to come. Next up, we'll be doing a dedicated one, I think, to our Moex tasting and also to Mitchell because, I mean, seeing Francois is always one of my favourite things. So, yeah. Do you want to say goodbye?
Goodbye, Joe.
Thanks.
And it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
Cheerio.